top of the hour, so I'll go ahead and get started. And we are good to go.
Yep.
Cool. Hey folks, you're joining in for Build a Data Warehouse with SQL Database Projects for Data Toboggan. I'm Skwiers-Koballa. I'm a program manager at Microsoft, and today we're going to talk about one slice of Synapse, and that's the SQL engine and the data schemas that are associated with that. We're going to be talking about that in this session because as a program manager at Microsoft, I'm actually on the tools and experiences team around SQL. So Synapse is a very powerful collection of different functionalities, one of which is a really enterprise scale data warehouse that's then augmented by the pipelines that can be added to it, and then the Spark pools. So as a part of my work with tools and experiences, I get to be great friends with a bunch of folks working on Synapse and making sure that some of the best things from SQL are available for Synapse and the data warehouse in there. So in case you're looking at these slides at a later time, that is how you pronounce my name, Skwiers-Koballa. My pronouns are he, him. If you find me funny here today, you will find my Twitter potentially also funny. I joined Microsoft about a year ago. Before that, I worked for a small company doing a lot of stuff with databases, some of them good, and also a developer. And then just a fair warning that I have unrelated interests involving pugs, chickens, and gardening. So brace yourself, full human here. But back to what we're talking about today. Some of the tools that come along with the world of the SQL Data Warehouse and Synapse are SQL Package, Azure Data Studio, and then there's a component of Visual Studio. SQL Package is going to be the first thing that we talk about because it's a foundational command line interface that kind of enables those other graphical tools. Even if you don't use SQL Package directly, it's great to know it's behind the scenes so you can watch for updates and releases to it and understand when new features are being added. SQL Package is one of those things that we're updating regularly and bringing more and more of those great Synapse features into. Like I mentioned, Synapse is not just SQL, there is extra stuff to it. And so we're going to talk, when we talk about SQL Package and when we talk about Azure Data Studio and Visual Studio, we're going to talk not just about generically the capabilities of the tool, but as well as specifically when you're dealing with a data warehouse, what are the things to know and keep in mind so that you're really able to maximize the value there. SQL Package is the command line interface to an underlying framework that allows us to move either the schema of a database or the schema and some data of the database around. So if you're at your computer or if you're in a CI/CD pipeline and you want to pull the schema of a database out so that you can save it in source control or so that you can then manipulate it and then potentially deploy it to a test environment, so on and so forth, you would be able to use SQL Package and the extract operation to bring that down into what's called a DAC pack or a data tier application file. Data tier application files are an artifact of a database that includes all those schema objects. The reverse operation or a publish takes that schema and applies it to a database. We'll dig into a little bit more of some of the things that are happening under the covers and why a DAC pack is different than just running a bunch of scripts. The other thing with SQL Package that is kind of common in your run-of-the-mill databases is the backpack import and export operations. A backpack takes the schema of a DAC pack and also includes all the data of a database. Pause on that thought of about including all the data of the database. We'll come back to that because regular databases, that's fine. data warehouses, that could be problematic. What does running SQL Package entail? I mentioned it's a command line utility. So when you're using it, likely like in your terminal, your command line, you're going to be using the SQL Package exe. You can download it as a zip folder for any platform. So this terminal that I built in PowerPoint kind of looks like the Windows terminal, but it could actually be your shell in a Linux machine or a Mac OS. So just kind of like how Synapse Studio brings working with Synapse to a bunch of different platforms from the browser level, a lot of these tools that I talk about today bring these capabilities to multiple platforms, but just not through the browser. The parameters that you end up needing to use with SQL Package generally have the format of / and then action, and then you'll need to say whether or not you're doing an extract or a publish, so on and so forth. And then there's going to be specific parameters for different actions. For example, with extract, we need to say this is the file name that I want to bring that schema down in, as well as where is it coming from. Some of these parameter names are rather long, and if you're looking stuff up on the internet about SQL Package, you may very well see the parameters in their short form names. It can be a little hard to read at first, so just kind of brace yourself for that. Now, before I demo some of the capabilities with SQL Package, I asked you to hold on to the thought that a backpack includes all of the data along with the schema of a database. For Synapse, in those dedicated pools, especially the data could be very large, terabytes. Even when you're playing around with some sample data sets, it can be big. So there's considerations like the file size and it getting stored on your local machine when you run SQL Package, and how much room do you have on your hard drive. Maybe you have a fancy hard drive, maybe not. But then there's also the data transfer. How long do I have to wait for the data to go from Azure to my computer? And so one of the considerations that's been made is, what about Parquet files? Parquet files are an alternative file format that really optimizes for size, efficiency, and performance, kind of like a CSV, but with a slightly difficult name to pronounce. You might already use Parquet files in bringing in data, either through select statements or to copy into tables. And so you see kind of the power of those little flat file formats. For Synapse, earlier this spring, I believe, we added a couple parameters, again, specific to Synapse, that not only do an extract of that schema to the DAC pack, brings it to your local computer, but if you add a blob storage endpoint, the container, and then the storage key, which has been redacted here, it's going to drop all of the data out of those tables into Parquet files in Azure storage. So we'll do that here real quick. So I've downloaded SQL Package, and I've extracted the folder into this folder here. So there is, if I can remember my alphabet, there is SQL Package exe there in the folder that I'm able to now use when I run a command. So the basic command from that slide, with the addition of a Synapse username, as well as a password, which I'll reset after this. Ooh, I'm so bad with Snagit, I apologize about that. The username and the password, and then again, those Azure storage items. When I run this command, it's going to go ahead and grab the database and the schema. So it's grabbing the schema from the database, it's going to give me a file sample.dacpack in this folder, but now it's also extracting the data. So it's going through every table in the sample database, and it's pulling out all that data. The data is not coming to my local computer. We've got the DACPAC file now here, but if I go to my storage account in the container data export, which is one of my parameters, I now have folders for all of the tables, including that Parquet file for the taxi table that has quite a bit of data in it. So that's one way to get the data out of your instance, whether you need to go to a test instance or you're looking to just literally have a single table, but it gives you those options there. The opposite is in place for the publish action. You can grab Parquet files from these Azure endpoints to allow for bringing a schema and data back in for the specific application of Synapse where you're going to be dealing with very large data sets. So that was kind of the specific application of SQL Package to Synapse and the SQL dedicated data warehouse there. Mark, do we have a question from the chat or anything?
Well, I'm dumbfounded. I mean, there's a few things that have appeared in the chat just about. I mean, allegedly, I know my stuff. When did this appear? This is so cool.
When did this appear? I love that question. So the folks working on SQL Package, and especially the folks working around Data Warehouse, have been doing a fantastic job. There's a page specific to this in the docs for SQL Package. And then in the release notes, let's go back and see when it was added, because this is definitely something I wanted to point out. SQL Package underlies some of the graphical tools, but it's always great to grab the newest version. Predict came in just in June. That was in March. I think this came in back in September. No. It might have been in March.
The doc was up. Well, it was last updated in March, but that
there we go. There is in March.
Sooner.
So yeah.
How did we? How? That's all I can say. I'm dumbfounded. I mean, If anyone takes anything away today, if there's one thing, and I'm not degrading anything that people might learn, this is probably the most important thing I've taken away today.
So yeah.
Oh, good. All right.
So like I mentioned, SQL Package, any platform, grab the zip, download it, play with it. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, that was SQL Package and the schema and the data capabilities of it. I do want to step back one moment and say, okay, yeah, being able to grab the data is great, especially having test instances and all that, but just the data schema. What about developing and managing that schema? I mentioned the publish operation, allowing us to take a DACPAC and apply it to a database. In this case, it's going to be an incremental operation where if the database already exists, that's fine. In fact, that's great. The SQL Package operation is going to do that incremental change. It's going to generate the alter statements for you. So you're going to end up with a database that matches the DACPAC. To be really concrete about this idea, this is the idea of declarative database development. It's something that's frankly kind of unique to the Azure SQL family of databases. So whether we're talking about Synapse SQL or SQL Server or Azure SQL Database, the capabilities that come from SQL Package and DAC effects to do declarative development is something that can take a little getting used to, especially if you're coming from like MariaDB or another database and trying to do data warehousing there. So what's happening in declarative database development is you're developing for the end state. I want to have this table, this view, that's it. So you're writing create statements. When you're writing T-SQL, you don't have to worry about alter or create or alter. It's just create. And so that's why it's called state-based development. When you are working with the tools that you use, like Azure Data Studio, Visual Studio, SQL Package, that's going to be managing the change and migration. So when you are working in Azure Data Studio or Visual Studio, you take the T-SQL and you're able to run a build command that creates that DAC pack, that data tier application file, and that's your development artifact. Stepping back to, okay, you're developing T-SQL, it's all in the same syntax, so you're able to do version control. You have a collection of SQL files, and so you can keep track of, we made this change then, we made this change now. There's a lot of capabilities that come from that, and then the DAC pack is the result from there. SQL Package, DAC effects, manages that publish to a live database, whether it's test or production, and applies the DAC pack and makes those changes for you. You don't have to then look at the scripts and say, wait a minute, table 1 already exists, so I just need to alter column. No, that's managed for you. There's a wide array of ways that you can fine tune that. Not near enough time today, but suffice to say, it ranges from being able to generate the scripts and look at them while you're doing the publish to being able to actually, if this is your thing, code in C# and do very specific deployment contributors that change the way deployments happen and manipulate things. So extremely extensible. If it doesn't work for you right out of the box, there's a lot of things that can be tuned. But overall, you gain some real efficiency of being able to develop T-SQL that's easy to version control. How, Drew, do we do this? Two options. The one that's been around, you might have heard about, is SQL Server Data Tools in Visual Studio. The other one that has also been around for almost a year now, we're getting there, and the benefits of being in Azure Data Studio, it is by and large the availability of SQL Database Projects to folks working on Mac OS or Linux. You don't need to run Windows VM, thanks to SQL Package and a number of other things coming to the .NET Core SDK. You're able to do this T-SQL develop and build from either of these tools. So even if you just want something more lightweight than Visual Studio from time to time, that's a nice thing. SQL Server Data Tools in Visual Studio has been there for years. It's a GA product. The SQL Database Projects extension in Azure Data Studio is in preview. It's been there since September of last year, and we're working towards parity with the Visual Studio breadth of features. I'm going to look at what some of these things are right now, but just for those of you that are already familiar with SSDT, things that are there in Azure Data Studio are going to be the pre and post deployment scripts, being able to use database references, loading deployment profiles, which allow you to reuse the similar settings, as well as the ability to do schema compare. All in all, the big win here is that there's compatibility between SQL projects that are worked with in Azure Data Studio and in SQL Server Data Tools. It's great that SQL projects allow you to use version control, but it's really great when you get to use version control with a team of developers and kind of scale the development capabilities. Synapse is extremely powerful, and there's a wide array of different functionalities, and so you're going to have different people coming at it from different perspectives, whether they're there for the Azure Data Factory, whether they're there because they're experts in working with the Spark notebooks. There's so many different things, so being able to bring the entire team in on whatever tool they are comfortable using is a win. So I want to take a look at Azure Data Studio and database projects in Azure Data Studio. There's something I really want to make sure we point out when it comes to database projects and Synapse, because the schemas can become so large. It's potentially a data warehouse for the entire company. And so you could have multiple different schemas. You could just have a bajillion tables. No judgment there. So how do you make that a little bit more manageable? First thing before we look into that is an inevitable question of, I've already started building my database. Is it too late for me to go back and use SQL projects? Has the ship sailed? And the good news is absolutely not. You can certainly start using SQL projects at any time. I know that some people prefer the workload of writing a bunch of scripts and shipping them out to a production system that's not being used heavily and then coming back to use SQL projects. In Azure Data Studio, once you have the SQL Database Projects extension installed, when you right-click on a database, you can create a project from the database. So when you do that, it's going to extract out the full schema. You'll be able to tell it where you want it, how you want those objects to be brought into the project. And for the sake of time, I've already run that on that database. So we already have all of those objects scripted out here on the left. So we've got a bunch of tables, like our currency dimension table, or this taxi trip table that we saw earlier with the Parquet file. So these scripts are all going to be in that same declarative format: create table, create view. We can make changes to them. So let me add another totally meaningless column here to table 1. I mentioned that it's that build action that gets you the DAC pack, your artifact file. So that would be something from this menu here where you can build, publish, and do schema compare. I'm going to click manage real quick because I want you to see the database dashboard that makes some of these actions a little bit easier to find in some ways, as well as the change target platform. In the world of Synapse, you're potentially already used to people assuming that you're talking about SQL Server or Azure SQL and not the data warehouse that comes along with Synapse. So make sure that if you are working on a project that you set that target platform to either Azure SQL Data Warehouse or Synapse. It will be in some places. But we can apply the build action here, and it's going to build all of these scripts into a DAC pack that we could use to publish to a data warehouse one or many times. Once you have that DAC pack file, it's reusable. It'll apply the schema in that way. The other thing that can be very helpful kind of within the tooling around SQL projects, even if you're not necessarily using SQL projects and DAC packs, is the schema compare extension that integrates in here. What the schema compare extension allows us to do is from the project, it builds the DAC pack. And then it says, what kind of target do you want to compare it to? So I can compare my project locally to a Synapse data warehouse and see what's happened on that data warehouse. There might be other people that have alter access that aren't great about getting their changes into the SQL project. Maybe you're onboarding them now, or maybe you've made changes to your project and you're having trouble tracking them in source control. So you just want to see the differences. So this comparison will happen, and now we see the change from our project to that actual Synapse data warehouse is the additional column that's been added. So there are some tools that come along with SQL projects that are great for managing things. I mentioned that there's some ways that you can work with SQL projects that can help if you have a lot going on. So going back to our project, I created this project by pulling the schema out of a database. But let's say there's another business unit, there's another department that wants to on board to the data warehouse, and they're going to be adding a lot of stuff. One way to kind of compartmentalize things is through composite projects. Over here on the left, we have a single project open. I'm going to add a new project. So let's see, new. I call it new department project, and I'm going to put it. I'm going to put it in a folder nearby. And when I create this, it's going to be added to the current workspace. If you're familiar with Visual Studio, this is similar to the concept of a solution. If you're familiar with VS Code, it's the VS Code workspace concept. But ultimately, what it means is now we have two projects loaded in Azure Data Studio. Right now, they're two separate projects. So I can come to my new department project and I can add a table called Saturday mornings, because that's the kind of table description you get from me on Saturday mornings. So now we have a table. Great. Two separate projects, this extra table. What if on my primary project, I want to make sure that it brings with it this project here when it's deployed? I can hand new department project off to folks over there. They can work on it kind of in their compartmentalized world. Maybe this primary project is really big and takes a while to open or takes a long time to build, and they just need to focus on 20 objects, not 2,000. They can work on this project, but in this primary project up here, I'm going to add a database reference to project, new database project, and I'm going to say this location is the same database. So this is connecting these two projects together in a way that now they are both going to be built together and deployed together when you build workload Synapse demo. So I'm going to build that project. And as it scrolls by, give it a minute to finish so that I point at things that you can focus on. We have succeeded. And I have the workload Synapse demo. And I have the, of course I did that. And I have the new department project DACPack, both being built. When I deploy this now, publish it. What better time to deploy to production than on Saturday mornings? Going to deploy it to my already existing dedicated database. So this publish is happening. Right now, if I sneak over here really quick, let's see if I can beat the, so the deploy is in progress. I want to so my Saturday morning table was not there when I opened up this before the DACPack had finished deploying, but now if I refresh, there it is. There's my Saturday mornings table. So it got brought along for the ride. That extra department's schema was also deployed. So if you start to find your data warehouse is getting large, consider composite projects. So that was using database references and using the same database location. There's a lot of ways to get data into your data warehouse through Synapse. It's all right there. I mean, ADF is literally in Synapse Studio. People are going to want to put data in them. Don't let SQL projects stand in the way. Use those composite projects. So we talked about being able to create the project from the database. I did skip over when I published. I hit publish real quick to apply the changes immediately. There was a generate script button right next to it, and that'll give you the changes that you want to apply, but as a script, so you can have a little bit more fine-grained control. The other thing that we looked at was schema compare and being able to look at what those changes were between the database and the SQL project. So that kind of gave us that round trip through SQL Database Projects in Azure Data Studio. Before we step past Azure Data Studio, I'm going to remove this database reference for purposes of the next demo into SSDT and Visual Studio, just to keep things clean. You can remove the project. There's a number of different ways to tear things apart. I didn't point out the source control pane here in Azure Data Studio, but this is tied into a Git repository and allows us to do that tracking of, hey, this view script has had changes. It looks similar to schema compare, but it's against the source controlled version of the tools. All right. Mark, do we have any questions from the chat on Azure Data Studio before I step forward?
Yeah, so there were for publish, are there any naming standards that need to be followed for importing files? And would this support storing data in folders? So I guess
I think that's back to the SQL package. I will have to pull the naming standards from some of our reference files. I believe that documentation's still in the works. So I will have my email at the end of the presentation. So if the question asker wants to reach out to me, I can make sure to let them know.
It's in the Slack channel. Also, Bob wanted to know the SQL. How does SQL package output differ from SQL project? They look similar.
Yeah, they are related. So SQL package is going to output those artifacts of a DAC pack or a backpack. SQL projects come one step before the DAC pack and pull it into a full schema of SQL files.
All right. I think Bob said he was thinking of storing the SQL package in Git, so the objects are automatically versioned. And then, so does it support importing of existing set of DDL from a SQL script file like VS SSDT?
Yes, we do have an option to add script. It's more singular. It's not going to be your full import the full folder yet.
Cool. All right, cool. That's as far as, yeah.
Go ahead and close Azure Data Studio. I mentioned that Azure Data Studio, the SQL Database Projects is in preview and is kind of coming up to parity to the SQL Server Data Tools breadth and depth of functionality. It was mentioned in the chat about the ability for SSDT to import a bunch of scripts to bring in DDL. That's one way to do it beyond creating a project from a database to bring in those scripts. But there are some in-depth type things that SSD has that haven't come to Azure Data Studio yet. There was one in particular that can be really helpful when developing a relational database that's going to have reporting and semantic implications. So if you're thinking about, okay, I'm building this data model that's going to be used in Power BI or other reporting tools, there are going to be things that either have to be very performant or that we want to make sure are named consistently so it's easy for people to use. And that comes down to static code analysis. Static code analysis comes within Visual Studio and SSDT and allows specific rules to be applied to all of those VDL or SQL scripts. Out of the box, there are a number of different somewhat obvious type rules, like don't use select star, because then you're going to have the schema changing as the underlying objects change, and everyone loves when their columns disappear. But this is one of those things where as you build out a data warehouse and then other people are building into it, you can actually custom create rules and then load them in. And so it'll give you a very quick way to look at, okay, a bunch of stuff has been built. Is it all compliant with our naming standards, or have we avoided specific actions? There are some examples that have been created and shared, and there are a bunch of third-party examples that are really great. So check all those out. But for code analysis in Visual Studio, I am going to fire up Visual Studio. And I'm going to open up my project. And we saw that there was a rule about not using select star, depending on how dogmatic you are about things. That can be an important rule to follow. We do have a view in our example here that is select star. When I build this project, I don't get any warnings. It just works. There's no one to save me from myself. But what if we go into properties? Under code analysis, so it'll probably load up under project settings for you, but if you go down to code analysis, we've got all these different rules, and we can leave them all checked to see how bad things really are in my sample here, but we're going to enable code analysis on build. Save my properties there, and now we're going to build again. And it's going to succeed, but it's going to give me, where is my error? Lost my error pane. There we go. It gave me a warning, which is not necessarily what you want to happen. I mean, if this was a really bad mistake, let's say if we have drift, our entire reporting system stops working. Select star would be really bad. All right, well, let's go back to our properties. And instead of just a warning for select star, I want it to be an error. Let's make this really severe. Save. Let's try to build again. Oh, it failed. It failed. And now this is an error. So you can fine tune how the code analysis is applied beyond just custom writing rules. You can also say specific rules are really important to me or the company. There's a whole depth of functionality around SQL projects and Visual Studio. So there's a lot to learn and know there, but this one is most specifically helpful for Synapse data warehouses. Those of you who were super observant may have noticed something funny about my Visual Studio. The public preview one for Visual Studio 2022 is coming soon. So when I mentioned Azure Data Studio, I skipped over kind of the general premise that it's open source and it's shipped about every month. And so you'll have updates coming behind the scenes with SQL Package on a monthly basis. Visual Studio is shipped almost on that same cadence, but there is a very significant version bump coming up, especially to those large data warehouse projects, because Visual Studio 2022 is going to be 64-bit. Really like high level, what that means is if you are loading a SQL project into Visual Studio and it hits its 4 GB limit when it's trying to process and bring those files in, Visual Studio 2022 will not have that limitation. So for those of you who have particularly ugly projects with lots and lots of things, or it's a very large composite project, check out the preview coming soon. Give us your feedback. We certainly want to continue building tools for you. That is the content that I had planned to demo and share today. But here are some resources. I will put the link to the deck that obviously has these links to the resources in the Slack channel as well. But I do really appreciate your time and would be happy to take a few more questions. This is how you can get in touch with me should you be so inclined to ask questions at another time.